Back in 1994, the company Sony was preparing to launch its first PlayStation console. The company had a less than desirable reputation in the world of video games. 1 year before the launch of the PlayStation, Sony ImageSoft published some below average game titles such as Cliffhanger and Last Action Hero, and many employees within the industry were still talking about the fact that Sony had been rejected by Nintendo. Sony wanted to produce a CD-ROM drive for the SNES. Nintendo president at the time, Hiroshi Yamauchi, didn't like the terms. He was already cautious of Sony, who had demanded game developers to use its expensive, established audio tools for the SSMP audio chip. He was also concerned by Sony's growing influence across music, film, and software. CEO at the time, Ken Kotaragi, eventually persuaded the company to abandon the Super NES CD-ROM, instead pursue development of a standalone 5th-gen console, the PlayStation. With no genuine video game credentials to its name, how exactly could Sony challenge Nintendo and Sega? The answer was third-party support. Sony made the PlayStation the hottest system in town by giving it powerful specs, making it relatively easy to develop for and reducing the license cost per disc, which meant that publishers could sell games for significantly less than they could with cartridge software, while still maintaining all the important profit margins. Sony's strategy worked out, and within its first year, the PlayStation established itself as the market leader all over the globe. But you could make the argument that one company stood apart from the rest when it came to assisting and perhaps saving the PlayStation during the early years when the console launched. The company was Namco. Let me explain. Founded in 1955 as Nakamura Seisakusho, Namco would become one of the gaming industry's leading lights thanks to a string of arcade hits like Pac-Man and Galaga, just to name a few. Like so many of its competitors, Namco supported its position in the 1980s by aggressively backing Nintendo's Famicom console, known as the NES in the West. However, from the very beginning, Namco's relationship with Nintendo was very rocky, reflecting the battle of wits that Namco founder Masaya Nakamura waged with Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi. Nakamura got his son-in-law, Ishimura, to put together a team to reverse engineer the Famicom hardware and create a port of Galaxian, a port that was so good that it was presented to Nintendo along with the message that Namco intended to manufacture and release it without Nintendo's consent. A threat that enabled Namco to sign a 5-year contract with Nintendo that was weighed heavily in its favor, allowing the company to manufacture its own Famicom carts rather than order them from Nintendo. However, the company's perceived arrogance would come back to bite it. Nintendo created a strict licensing strategy on the back of this event to ensure no other company would ever get the same treatment, and when the 5-year deal expired, a deal which had given Namco several million selling hits and filled its money box considerably, Yamauchi was less inclined to bow to Nakamura's pressure and told Namco that it would have to sign the same deal as every other publisher. Although Namco would sign the new agreement anyway, it wasn't going to turn its back on the cash cow that was the Famicom. Nakamura was reportedly furious and quickly made it a company policy to explore other platforms, including the NEC PC Engine and Sega Mega Drive. Namco even briefly talked about producing its own console, but this never happened. However, the company was still very much aware that home hardware was its crucial market, and when Sony announced the PlayStation in 1994, Namco quickly signed up as its first third-party supporter of the platform. Every game console needs a killer game at launch, a game title which demonstrates precisely why consumers should invest in it. For the PlayStation, that game was Ridge Racer, a port of the 1993 arcade racing title of the same name. Reportedly produced in 6 months, the PlayStation conversion was nothing short of a revelation. While it wasn't quite arcade perfect, it was a close enough approximation of the coin-op that caused gamers around the world to start noticing the PlayStation console. Namco's relationship with Sony would go beyond being just a third-party ally. However, the game Tekken, seen as the PlayStation's answer to Sega's massively popular Virtua Fighter, was produced using the System 11 arcade hardware based on the PlayStation architecture. This ensured a smooth conversion, and while conversations are still being discussed on whether or not Namco's Brawler is a true match for Virtua Fighter, it contributed to another success for Sony and Namco. You can also make the argument that the years 1994 and 1995 were Namco's most productive years in video game history. The PlayStation launch lineup was pretty solid, but take away Namco's Ridge Racer and Air Combat, and it's definitely less appealing. Would that affect the sales of the PlayStation? Maybe, but it's too hard to tell. Let me introduce you to Paul Davies. He was working at EMAP Images at the time and would become CVG editor as the PlayStation reached its commercial apex, is an agreement. I quote, "From launch, PlayStation became Namco console. Ridge Racer was the main reason to buy PlayStation in December of 1994, and then Tekken in early 1995. Both were so close to the coin-op originals that it felt like the truest arcade experience at home, showcasing what PlayStation was capable of, which was stunning." Paul Davies also explained, at the time, Sega had Virtual Fighter for Saturn, which played superbly well but looked poor in comparison. With Ridge Racer, Namco included secrets to unlock, adding huge replay value. The near simultaneous launch of Tekken in arcades and on console was unheard of. That partnership between Sony and Namco was simply a killer tactic. If you think in terms of Tekken being the Fortnite of its day, which I believe it was, that it was exclusive to PlayStation was huge. Anyways, while Sony would attract other big allies like Capcom, Square, Eidos, and Enix, the almost exclusive association with Namco ensured throughout the machine's life thanks to a seemingly unending stream of AAA titles, all of which couldn't be found on any console. The relationship between the two firms was so tight that Sony itself issued advertisements for Namco's games promoting them with the same energy one would expect of first-party titles. While there were some game flops thrown into the mix, Cyber Sled was an early misstep. The next few years were populated by a string of solid gold PlayStation classics from Namco, like Ridge Racer Revolution, Rage Racer, Time Crisis, Tekken 2, Soul Blade, Ridge Racer Type 4, Ace Combat 2, and Pac-Man World, just to name a few. The production line seemed to go on forever, and the Namco name on the cover was that what you were getting was a great quality product. Let me introduce you to Steve Jarrett. He's a longtime video game journalist and magazine editor. He said, "Namco's support over the following years provided a constant stream of varied and high-quality games," says Jarrett. "During this period, I think there was a certain gloss to Namco's games, the feeling that you wouldn't go far wrong with the Namco name on the box. I think the PlayStation still has succeeded without Namco's support, but it's undeniable that it got there faster with Namco's franchises on board. Its presence and heritage in the arcades brought a certain cachet, and it clearly has some top programmers who wrung every bit of power from Sony's hardware, and once they got the grips with the machine, Namco's sequels were revered as among the best games of the era." Let me introduce you to Sega Dreamcast console. Namco joined up with Sega to create Soul Calibur. This was seen as a major coup. However, the company remained mostly loyal to PlayStation line, continuing to support Sony with key titles like Ridge Racer 5 and Tekken Tag Tournament. Still, the generation-long bromance in between Sony and Namco was slowly coming to an end. Namco began to spread its wings and produce titles for the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox during the sixth generation of consoles. Today, the familiar red Namco logo has been replaced by one which displays two brands, Bandai and Namco. This is because the two companies merged in 2005. The company has also shifted into publishing, handling the likes of From Software's Elden Ring, Dark Souls, Little Nightmares 2, and as well as Supermassive's Dark Pictures series. Key properties from the 90s remain in active service, with Tekken and Ace Combat still getting regular sequels, but some would still argue that the company's hit rate is nowhere near as prolific as it was during the PlayStation 1 era. And of course, the company is no longer committed to a single format in the same way, as it has branched out onto both Nintendo and Microsoft systems. That feeling of exclusivity no longer exists. The Bandai Namco of today is arguably stronger and has a wider reach and influence than it did all those years ago, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the 90s was a truly magical time to be a PlayStation owner and a gamer in general. If you made it to the end, see you next time and thanks for watching.